Russian President Vladimir Putin is in Iran on a rare international trip since Russia launched what it terms its special military operation in Ukraine. Putin will take part in three-way talks with leaders of Turkey and Iran. He'll also separately meet with the Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi and the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. On the agenda are the global grain crisis, the ongoing war in Syria and the situation in Ukraine. The visit comes at a crucial time when, on one hand, the US is aiming to corner Russia after it started the war, and on the other, last week President Joe Biden warned Iran of harsh consequences if it develops nuclear weapons. The visit will offer Putin an opportunity to deepen ties with Iran. Meanwhile, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is already in Iran. He held talks with his counterpart Raisi and the Supreme Leader, where Khamenei reiterated Iran's stance that any offensive in northern Syria would be detrimental to the region. This is in response to Turkey's latest threat to launch another operation in northern Syria, which is opposed by Tehran and Moscow.
As expressed by dear Mr. President, our battle against terrorism is of great importance. The terrorist organizations are a great trouble for both countries, because these are the troubles that disturb the peace of any country in which they are active. Therefore, we should fight against these terrorist organizations in solidarity and alliance.
Both Russia and Iran have prevailed in their support of President Bashar al-Assad against the West, which called for him to be toppled since the Syrian civil war began in 2011. Our correspondent Jodie Cohen is joining us live from Ra'anana, and Dr. Anna Matveyeva, a Russian affairs analyst, is joining us from London to talk about what this visit means for Israel as well as the wider impact on the region. Well, Jodie, let's start with you. Israel will undoubtedly be watching this visit very closely. What's been the reaction so far?
Well, we haven't heard of a public reaction yet to the meetings. Everybody, I think, is taking a watch and wait approach. I think before we go into the details of what's going to be discussed in this trilateral summit today and in the bilateral meetings as well, it's really important just to take a step back and have a look at the optics. We saw President Biden from the US visit West Asia last week, where he met with Israeli interim Prime Minister Yair Lapid. And he also went on to Saudi Arabia, where he talked to the GCC+3 summit. That's the Gulf Cooperation Council. And there it was really a message of unity and regional cooperation in West Asia. And specifically on the agenda was regional cooperation against the threat coming from Iran. Roll forward to this week, and we knew that President Erdogan was visiting Iran, and President Putin from Russia has decided also to come along, and there's going to be a trilateral summit now today in Iran. And if you look at the optics of that, I think from Iran's perspective, it's important because it's really saying we're not isolated. There's this stalled Iran nuclear deal. There are sanctions against Iran, but we're still, we have allies. We're not isolated in West Asia. And for Russia, too, it's a message that far from being isolated, that they're strong in West Asia. And despite sanctions, despite the war with Ukraine, they are still a huge global player. Turkey, too, it's an opportunity for them to show that they're playing a pivotal role. And with Turkey's position, it's interesting because they've got relations with Iran. They've got relations with Israel, obviously got relations, across the board. And they're actually going to be discussing a UN-backed agreement on whether or not they'll be able to release grains that are stuck in Ukraine. So it won't just be West Asia watching this summit. It will be many countries around the world. Huge implications for them all.
And Dr. Matveyeva, let's turn to you. What does this trip, and it is a rare international trip by the Russian president, signal about Russia's relationship with Iran?
Yes, that visit is incredibly important. We need to bear in mind that this is already the second time that President Putin is meeting with Iranian leadership since the start of the war in Ukraine in February. First time they met in Ashgabat on the margins of the oil summit. So three issues on the agenda. all incredibly important. One is grain, export of grain from Ukraine, how to do it, how make sure that Russia comes as a winner with strengthened international alliance behind it and not lose face. Secondly, the issue of Iran possibly becoming nuclear. Russia does have concerns. Iran is a neighborhood country. So if that would happen, Russia needs to know that it is going to be a safe passage to nuclear Iran rather than uncontrollable and chaotic and potentially dangerous. And thirdly, the war in Syria. Russia and Iran have a counterweight to Turkey. They are trying to do it. They are trying to use political means. That means that high-level diplomacy is geared into action because they are very reluctant to confront Turkey in Syria militarily, especially now in the time when these three players need more solidarity among them.
And Jody, let's turn back to you. With Russia and Iran seemingly strengthening their ties, what does it mean for the wider region, in particular, what impact that could have on Israel?
So I think primarily Israel will be looking at what is decided, if anything, in terms of the movement of forces in Syria. We've got Iran entrenching their forces across the region. Russia is in charge of the airspace there. Israel is very concerned about not allowing Iran to be too close to the Israeli border. So that will be an absolute concern. Also they'll be keen to hear of any discussions in terms of the nuclear deal. We know in the latest that Iran has reportedly got the capability of creating a nuclear bomb, and what will be key to not only Israel but to its allies across West Asia to be to ensure that Iran does not get the capability of putting a nuclear bomb onto a missile. So that will be top on the agenda and what they will be most watching out for.
And Dr. finally, let's go back to you. Where do you see things going from a regional relationship point of view, particularly from a Russian perspective? Do you see potentially something of a creation of a strong power bloc within the region, with Russia and Iran very much joining forces?
They are, but to some extent in Syria, they are also supporting different forces to some extent. Iran is a Shia country. It has some kind of religious identity which it seeks to promote. Russia is a secular country, so it supports more kind of first forces of secularism in Syria. Yes, they do have a common agenda in general terms, but when we look at details, it is not really always uniform. Russia is now in a sort of weaker position in Syria because, yes, it does have control over skies, but it needs everything which it has to be geared towards the war in Ukraine. So that would mean that certainly priorities in terms of air support would be going to different war theater, which is now vital for Russia as they are on the offensive. Last point, again, we should not forget that Iran and Russia are major energy producers. They are both under some level of international sanctions. So for Russia, it is incredibly important to keep a united front with Iran so that Iranian leadership does not make some kind of separate deal with the West on oil and gas sector in exchange maybe for some vague promises of lifting sanctions. So because Russia is still holding the hand on the pulse of oil and gas, definitely, they want Iran to be an ally, and they want Iran to be a reliable ally so that they can negotiate with the West, at least in the energy field, from their position of strength.
Dr. Anya Matveeva joining us live from London. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks to Jody Cohen joining us from Israel.